Good evening. I'm Lori Rabashaw, the Executive Director of La Grua Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our talk this evening as part of our Good Stories Well Told series. La Grua Center's mission is to engage community through arts and culture, and we do so by presenting a variety of concerts, art exhibitions, and speakers on a wide range of topics. We are now presenting these events as best we can on digital platforms like tonight's chat on Zoom. We usually start with a little housekeeping. I'm coming to you from my home office in Stonington, Connecticut, and our program director, Kelly Rocherol, is behind the scenes from her home office in neighboring Pawcatuck. We're trying something a little different tonight in that we welcome your faces on camera, if we could figure out how to do that. So that way it gives our speakers some folks to talk to on her screen. So please consider putting yourselves on camera, but still being on mute. And if we have to do something here at headquarters, we will try to figure that one out. It's a brave new world, folks. We welcome your questions after the talk and ask you to write them in Zoom's Q&A feature, which is on your screen. Kelly will come on after the chat and read those questions. Our discussion is being recorded and it will be available on La Grua Center's YouTube channel in the next week or so. This is also the time when I take a moment to thank the many people who donate to La Grua Center's annual fund each year, and I know some of you are with us tonight. Your gifts are a big part of making our year-round programming possible, and they matter now more than ever during this time of COVID when we can't gather together in person. So now onto our talk. Although Tory McCagg grew up in Michigan, her New England roots are even stronger via the summer she spent at her grandparents' home in Stonington, going to Connecticut College, living for many years in Providence, and most recently, living, as she says, off the grid in her New Hampshire home that prompted the book she's going to tell us about. Her stories started as blogs, and while very personal, they also deal with such larger issues as our environment and its sustainability, health and wellness, and even life and death. I'll take this moment to publicly offer our sympathy to Tory and her sister Xanda, who I believe is in the audience, on the recent passing of their mom, Louise McCagg, this past Thanksgiving. Louise was a visual artist who exhibited widely both in the US and abroad, and as I understand from her obituary, which was so beautifully written, assumed by her daughters, put up a hell of a fight against the progression of Parkinson's disease the last 20 years of her life. And we know Tory is going to talk about chickens, because they're in the book's title. And before I turn it over to her, I urge you to consider buying her book. A link to its page on the Bank Square Books website was in your email that gave you the link, and I will try to put it up in the Q&A section as well. So please welcome Tory McCagg as she tells us about her life at the Crossroads with chickens. Hi, Tory.
Hello.
Look at that beautiful home in New Hampshire.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for having me.
And I'm going to disappear and let you do the reading and tell the story as you tell it. And welcome. And gee, look at that fireplace.
It's warm. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Lori and Kelly and La Grua Center for having me. We were out in the chicken coop with the chickens, but the connection wasn't good enough. So we are now in the house instead of in the chicken coop. So I'm quite a bit warmer than I would have been. And so my segue into the reading is different. How did I end up here in Jaffrey, New Hampshire? The short version is that it was a chicken named Big Redsfald. A longer version can be found in my book, At Crossroads with Chickens, A What If It Works adventure in off-grid living and quest for home. It's the story of how my husband Carl and I moved to New Hampshire just for the winter to live in our newly built off-grid timber frame cabin with our chickens, 2 cats, and big imaginations. Like that plan, so went the planned book tour for this book. Originally, we were going to be doing a drive across country. And because of the coronavirus, I've been walking across to the chicken coop for the all cooped up book tour, and of which this is a part. Appropriately, this At Crossroads with Chickens required that because it's about adaptation and change at this place that we call Darwin's View. It also has sustainability and what I've learned about living off grid, chicken dramas, my mother's battle with Parkinson's disease, interlacing with Mother Nature's whims, and home, seeking, finding, and saving it. I thought it would be appropriate, given that the LaGrua Center is in Stonington, Connecticut, where I grew up, to read a bit of the book that actually mentions Stonington. So it was in Stonington that I learned the ocean's language. I walked on beaches, sand crunching under my feet as I picked perfect seashells and admired the prehistoric carapace of dead horseshoe crabs. Wading into the cool shallows of the harbor's water, I would stand still as minnows darted past my ankles, tickling my toes. Seagrass caught and clung to my calves. The damp, salt air frizzed my hair, coating my skin with salt and sand, and filling me with the smells of fish and brine and seaweed. The call of a foghorn, the cries of seagulls, terns, and cormorants, tumultuous waves balancing calm waters, like yin and yang encircling, splashing on the beach. The ocean, with its ebb and flow, is about motion. Into oceans, one can immerse oneself, float, swim, or drown. Mount Monadnock speaks a different language. Some days it is lost to me in clouds or the blindness of routine. Other days I look to Mount Monadnock every few minutes, alternately veiled by shades of blue and purple haze, or exposed by the brilliance of the sun, the subtlety of the moon. Monadnock tries on a different mood with each passing moment. She is solidly there. Mountains don't move. Rather, they move only on glacial timescales. Thus, mountains counter an ocean's movement with stability and permanence. Mountains express the resonance of soil and stone. Majestic, beautiful. These are overused words that don't evoke Mount Monadnock's essence, her timeless magnetism that attracts artists and writers, musicians and dancers, hikers, leaf peepers, longtime residents. So many return again and again to be in her shadow or ascend her rocky shoulders. Why? Some come to follow in the footsteps of the famous. Transcendentalists Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller. Painters John Singer Sargent and Abbott Henderson Thayer. Writers Mark Twain, Thornton Wilder, and Willa Cather. Cather wrote some of her most famous works here and is buried in Jaffrey Center with her longtime companion Edith Lewis. And the musicians, Leonard Bernstein, Eric Copeland, Edward and Marion McDowell. These last two established the McDowell Colony, which boasts of having supported 7,700 artists. The Monadnock region has been and is alive with a creative ilk. Other people come perhaps because they have heard the mountain is a challenge to scale but accessible. They can climb her and return down in an afternoon, and only occasionally does the effort result in a broken leg or heart attack. Some people climb her every day, some once a week, some to get engaged, and others to spread a loved one's ashes. There have been clubs formed for annual walks up. Up until 1954, when it burned down, people stayed at the Rough and Tumble Hotel, the halfway house. And in Carl's youth, there was a hut at the top that he remembers vaguely as a concession stand. People and more people come here. Is it to be in the woods experiencing and learning from nature, or for the stupendous panorama that on a clear day extends to the John Hancock Building in Boston and the Green Mountains in Vermont? From our distance at Darwin's View, Carl and I note Mount Monadnock's presence as she is profiled by the sunrise's reflective blush, or the evanescence of a fiery sunset. Terrible and joyous, she penetrates our hearts. She dares Carl, if not me, to climb her, because the mountain syntax is best communicated when climbing, grasping the stone, and pulling up to see the marriage of granite and flora, as trees sit on rocks embracing. I will note here that because so many climb her, there is the suggestion that she is easy to summit. That is a bald-faced lie. At 3,165 feet above sea level, and with 300 feet of that rise being above the timberline, there's a lot of granite to scale. Granite is hard. It is rock, and Mount Monadnock, be she muse, classroom, or maker of great wind, is called a mountain for a reason. A beloved mountain. I would suggest that almost every one of the 100,000 plus people who come here each year have her hook in their hearts when they leave. She calls to them as a symbol of the spiritual and natural beauty of this region. And for those who have grown up here and returned, she holds a special place. Learning the mountains' language has been a test of endurance for me. Most times I only have a rudimentary understanding of it, but occasionally, when I'm not trying, I'm as fluent in it as I am in the ocean's language. Maybe because at some moments of the day, the foggy ones when purple haze lightly glazes the horizon, the hills are full of lakes and ponds made of gray and white and blue fog banks. The clouds are transient mountains, and the mountain becomes a silhouette of an ocean. And then a gunshot from the gun club. Machine gun fire, rat-a-tat-tat, shatters the peace. And I think of what this place might have been once, when people were killing people for big concepts like freedom and independence. And I imagine what it might become when Carl and I are no longer here. Glaciers becoming water, flooding land, joining oceans and mountains. Climate disruption and wars will happen because people will be people. We learn lessons again and again because too often we aren't listening, reflecting, remembering this, that oceans and mountains speak their own vernacular, expressions of life everlasting, and that we have no control, nothing but nothing, as the wind howls and the breezes whisper through purple mountains and from sea to shining sea. So the first part of the book is about how Carl, my husband, a trombonist, and I met and married, and the logic between why we adopted 6 chicks. I wanted to eat happy eggs, and that required that I see the hens laying those eggs with my very own eyes. So I ordered up some chicks, and they arrived by USPS on June 26, 2012, in a cardboard box with holes in it so that they might breathe, a pile of variegated balls of fluff. Over the weeks, those personalities proved themselves to be a motley crew of activity, skittering about, testing their boundaries, their tiny wings. I tidied their pasty butts, fed them, hovered and worried. They grew, fluff making way for feathers. Ping earned her name the day she practiced flapping. Her practice flapping ended her up on the wrong side of the coop box. Her gleeful announcement of escape swiftly turned into the alarm of separation anxiety when she realized no one had followed her. Lola, a bantam, and thus half the size of the others, resembled the cartoon characters Speedy Gonzales. Feisty, she would dash between her siblings to snatch a treat and then run away, dodging pecks, and typically ending up huddled under Rhoda Red, who was the largest of the chicks and protective, though not as motherly as Panda. Even at a young age, Panda had a gentle quality about her, as if guiding the others, chiding them when they got too rambunctious or aggressive. Chipper, the intellectual of the bunch, would stop suddenly to stare into space, perhaps contemplating one or another of the worries emanated by culottes, who, as her legs grew feathers, emanated a constant stream of clucks and trills that sounded remarkably like, "Oh no, oh no." The chicks' cheeps, initially endearing, soon began to grate on my nerves. If I couldn't hear them, they had obviously died. If I could, it was like nails on a chalkboard. They were, after all, calling for their mother. I had no feathers or fluff to warm them, keep them safe and warm. All I could do was tend to their kitty litter pan with its wood chips, chick feed, and water, and make sure the heat lamp kept them neither too hot nor too cold, but just right. They quickly outgrew that kitty litter pan. After 1 week, I moved them into a big cardboard box. After 3 weeks, I created a styrofoam board barrier with a large branch onto which they flew week 4. By week 5, their realm included the entire bathroom. The word sanitary echoed in my brain. If I wasn't careful, they would take over the house. Fortunately, we missed that inevitability when Rhoda Red turned out to be our boy, Big Red. Roosters are outlawed by Providence city limits where we lived at that time. And so we moved the hens and Big Red to Darwin's View in December of 2012, just for the winter. On page 71. Few trees had escaped the 2006-2007 timbering of our hilltop. Those that remained were debilitated by the ice storm of 2008. Of those that survived, we had some removed to provide full sun exposure for the solar panels. Thus, there wasn't so much as a blade of grass to stop the voluminous breezes coming over Mount Monadnock from slamming against the house and battering the chickens' hay chalet. Every night, 3 to 5 times a night, I would wake, my body tensed against the seemingly mortal danger of the winds that hammered the house. They convinced me that we were fools to be here. There. Early on in our just for the winter venture, while attempting dinner conversation over the outside din, I commented that the house sounded remarkably like an old wooden boat, one of those Spanish Armada galleons creaking and moaning in the middle of a typhoon. We aren't going to sink, Carl reassured me. Obviously, I said, but the house might get blown down. Nothing's going to take out this house. That's what they said about the Titanic, I remarked, just as the French doors that faced Mount Monadnock bowed in under the force of the most recent west wind blast, and we heard a loud pop. Just the house timbers settling in, Carl said as we both sat back down in our chairs and another gust hit the house. I found it a Pyrrhic victory that Carl finally looked nervous. Not that he admitted it, a very New Hampshire trait to be so unconvinced by the weather. Yeah, you'll hear when you comment on the blizzard conditions, the ice, the negative wind shear. That's what you might expect it being winter. And so at dinner parties, when guests comment on the wind, the doors bowing, the good fortune of an overbuilt house that could never be taken out by mere cyclones, I've learned to say, yeah, we've had worse. At which point people ask why we don't have windmills. The wind's dirty, we reply in unison. Coming over the mountain and swooping down and up, the wind is blustery and uneven. It might do to a very expensive windmill what it did to our anemometer the first day we put it up. Carl and I had sipped our morning elixir of Santo Domingo espresso roast cafe lattes and watched, rapt, the anemometer's receptor screen. It showed the wind averaging 30 to 40 miles an hour, 45, and then a gust slammed the house. The screen flatlined. Very bad timing. No anemometer and Blizzard Nemo tracking its way toward us. That first winter at Darwin's View, the winter of 2012-2013, had more biggest storms of the century alerts than had ever occurred in the brief history of humankind in the Weather Channel. Somewhere in our country, someone was getting slammed. More often than not, it was us. Having spent years worrying about the world's lack of snow due to the warming climate, it felt reassuring to be in the thick of it again. The beauty of snow, you can see the wind that is so eminently present at Darwin's View. Shrieking ghosts, pale viragos chasing scampering diapered cherubs across the fields, whirlwinds bashing against tumbleweeds that suddenly calm to nothing, only to rise up as fields of whistling grasses, oceans of frost. Whirls of energy that left parts of our hilltop, the chicken coop, 6 feet deep in snow, and parts, the car, swept free. And still the wind, still the snow, on top of a hill, off-grid, with solar panels, not windmills. Winter days are short, the result being less sun. And though daylight might come when it's snowing, there is even less sun, like none. If you depend on solar panels for your electricity and there's no sun, the batteries that would usually run the electricity in the house run down. Fortunately, we had our propane generator backup system. Every third or fourth day of no sun, the roar of the generator, typically starting up just as I turn on the espresso machine, assured us that all was in working order. Until one day, it didn't. Not that we noticed, because the batteries still worked. It's just they weren't supposed to get down to the very last drop. It's not good for them. One of the questions we were asked by our off-grid energy consultants in the planning stages was this: when you arrive at your off-grid house, do you want to flick a switch and have the lights turn on? Or are you okay with having to check how the system is working? My response: flick a switch. Carl's: how's it work? Carl's and my yin-yang approach. Whereas I prefer to spend my time on the whys of life, he asks the hows, which is far more helpful and relevant when in the middle of a blizzard and the generator isn't working. A fact that Carl finally noticed when he went to check the batteries in the basement and noted that the inverter had gone into default. Thus, while I remained inside, worrying that Carl would get lost in the woods to our north, to be found in the spring inside the trunk of a dead tree where he had sought protection, Carl opted to take some initiative and a posteriori to test the wind velocity by troubleshooting the generator's untimely somnolence. I didn't mean to compare. Comparing is unhealthy. It causes resentment and anger. But there we were, 2 months into our little experiment, all by ourselves on our lovely hill with all kinds of amusements like wind, snow, and ice. And I had the stark realization that I preferred city living, where we didn't have to stoke a wood burning stove 5 times a night, where we didn't have to drive for 15 minutes to arrive somewhere, anywhere, where the walk to a market is not 8 miles and past a shooting range, and thus where a black and white toned city wardrobe doesn't have to be replaced with fluorescent orange. Most important of all, though, in a city, I could delude myself into thinking I could take care of myself. I could pretend, as does every good American, independence from things I am entirely dependent on. But in the country, I'm surrounded by acres of land we were supposed to be stewarding and living with a man who thrives on being outdoors in frigid cold, proof being his conviction that skiing in a blizzard is the penultimate form of fun. In the country, there's too much to learn and know, none of which includes sitting down in a cozy chair and reading a book. Thus, the dis-ease I had felt that first time Carl brought me to New Hampshire had not changed. Au contraire, and so I compared. For just a moment, staring out into the darkening skies, deserted by Carl, who was either already dead of a turbocharged electric shock from the generator or disappeared into the Darwinian Bermuda Triangle, thereby leaving me to fend for myself, I compared and felt resentful. I'd given up too much in this move to New Hampshire. I was unprepared. It wasn't fair. And then the roar of an engine, and my resentment melted into gratitude. Thank goodness for our Subaru. Carl was warming it up to drive me back to Rhode Island, right? No. Bought in 1998, the Subaru was a tank and a truck all in one. By 2013, in its dotage. One symptom, it would lock, then unlock its doors. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock, lock, unlock, unlock. At the same time, its lights blinked. Blink, blink. On, off, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. All this while the engine was off. Thus, the battery would die. Time and again, and this time too. When Carl stepped off the porch to go to the generator, the Subaru, perhaps out of joy like a lovesick puppy, began to unlock, lock, unlock, lock, unlock, lock, and blink, 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 then died. I would have left it to sit. There was a blizzard going on after all. Carl, ever the hands-on man and fully energized by the weather, jump-started it, thus the roar of the engine of the car, not the generator, and left it to run while he dug the generator out of the snow, at which point he realized the Subaru, lock, unlock, lock, had locked him out. While he attempted to jimmy the lock, ice forming on his long eyebrows, I braved the elephants to shovel the girls out of the hay chalet for the third time that day. Upon arriving at the door, I dipped into the run. Hay bale walls blocked the wind, leaving me to wonder if we shouldn't have used the same for our house. Also, the hay that served on the floor had begun the composting process. My unwitting success at deep litter mulching made for radiant heated floors. The hens cooed and clucked. The atmosphere was gentle and soothing, reassuring in their visceral calm. The chickens were being. No worries. Their only concern, where were the treats? At which point a peck, a squawk, and feathers flying. Big Red chastised and directed until the hens settled back down around him, and me too. Kneeling down in the run, I listened to the hens rustling and studied their social etiquette. Panda and Lola groomed themselves on either side of Big Red. Culottes uh-oh'd off in a corner. Ping and Chipper side by side caballed. Death felt very far away. The only suggestion of necrosis was Big Red's comb, which was blackened by frostbite. For all the time I had spent Googling possible remedies, the fault pointed back to the human element, drafts and moisture. Big Red looked at me with disapproval. What good was I if I couldn't heal his comb? Bowed, I crawled back out of the chicken coop and faced the buffeting shrill winds of Blizzard Nemo. The ice cold reddened my nose and pinched my cheeks. Struggling to maintain my footing against the wind, I watched the snow sweep across the fields. It was a stunningly beautiful winter afternoon, and myself expanded in the maelstrom, alive. Noting the car's headlights in the darkening skies, the running engine, I stopped the snow off my feet and headed inside. Carl hovered by the stove, warming his hands. In the dark, I reached to flick a switch. "Don't do that," he said. "The generator isn't turning on." "Excuse me?" I asked, though I knew. Off-grid, no sun, no generator? But I am the one who from day one said I wanted those light switches to work because I live in the 21st century. Ever with my priorities in order, I asked, Will we be able to use the espresso machine tomorrow morning? Carl called the generator guy, who, in the course of his interrogation of us, asked why we hadn't built a box around the generator to prevent it from sucking snow into itself, thereby freezing the system. And was the propane gas tank shoveled out? It needed air too. Now then, who would have thunk to build a box around either of those objects? Not us. In part because the generator company that installed the generator had said nothing about building a box around a generator that already has a metal box around it, one bought specifically for its added protection. Putting a ventilated box over a ventilated box? That's like having a piece of equipment that tests wind velocity burn out on the very first slightly windy day it's up and running. Thus, we had no anemometer for the two worst snowstorms in history. Thus, we had frozen our generator, and the emergency generator company's on-call guy didn't have four-wheel drive. If one were to be judgmental, one might ask why an emergency generator company based in New Hampshire doesn't provide its employees with some semblance of four-wheel drive transport. But we were not ones to judge. At least we tried not to, so full of faults ourselves. Besides, this was an adventure. We were adapting, evolving. That weekend, we did no laundry, nor did we vacuum. We allowed ourselves one latte per day and didn't charge our computers or cell phones. We had candlelit dinners with no technology to distract us. We couldn't remember the last time we had a candlelight dinner. Ever the how it works guy, and using a solar flashlight, Carl went down to the basement to see how many watts we were using. 150. The refrigerator was the only thing running electricity in the house. We had only candlelight and the light from the wood-burning stove to see by. It was very quiet, still, because this was life off-grid in the 21st century. All the luxuries of a regular home when the sun shines. So, as mentioned, my mother is a large part of this book, as is Mother Nature. And this section is just a little bit about her. And as a child, I would sometimes get off the yellow school bus at the art yard, the studio and foundry my mother had built with two artist friends. I would step off the bus and walk down the winding dirt driveway to the open field, where stood two half moons made of triangles forming pentangles, all connected according to the Buckminster Fuller's design. Energy efficient and wind resistant, the geodesic domes sat like spaceships in the middle of the field, surrounded by open space, blue skies, fresh air. Inside the studio, the smell of plaster and metal castings, clay and melted wax. Gray cement floors swept clean every day exposed the telltale signs of creation, drops and drips of dried clay, white plaster, paint. A pegboard wall held sundry drills, screwdrivers, hammers, polishers and buffers, clamps and saws. A rickety metal bookcase full of paint jars, glues, and silicone sprays. Wire armatures waiting for clay, and two heavy, long, rectangular work tables, sometimes clear, more often covered with clay models and molds, works in progress, and finished pieces, all furthering her practice of the lost wax casting method. Drawings and prints hung off the curved walls, and sculptures peopled the whole. In that dome, the air circulating, the radio playing classical music or NPR talk shows and news she created, her youthful arms strong from wedging clay and then molding it into life-size figures cast in bronze and aluminum. Her work embodied herself, elegant and raw, primal, a trio of headless female bodies, one with claws for feet, another a torso slashed, and exposed vulva. A totem of two stunted bodies, faceless and turning. A diving figure, a striding figure, a rising figure, distorted heads and writhing torsos. Discomforting, the sculptures represented the awful beauty and piercing vitality of life. At times, its claustrophobic constraints. My parents lived at a time of confusion that still exists in this society, in which success is based on work that earns money, preferably lots of money, and or youth and beauty. In which case, what is a woman's role? What is an artist's? Is art worthy in a society that values earned money over expression? And who determines whose art is valuable? What of all the artists undiscovered and all those who are discovered after death? What if a person's art is awful? Does that make their life a waste? And back to motherhood, unpaid and endless, undervalued, if at all, like the squandered wealth of nature. If one has children but has, too, other things to do, who is to say if that's right or wrong? And how dare anyone judge another's life, not knowing the choices and sacrifices it made in its formation? In her mid-50s, my mother sold her studio and foundry and returned to New York City. My father continued to teach at Michigan State University, but would travel between East Lansing and New York City for holidays. My mother, meantime, eventually bought a studio in the NoHo neighborhood of Lower Manhattan and began to take molds of the faces and bodies of friends, family, and strangers. She cast living masks, made them smaller and smaller, distorting them as they shrank, still using the lost wax casting method. Roman series, Etruscan series, grids and abacuses, books and walls of faces, congregations. Once, when I visited her early on in her repatriation to New York, she and I were late and racing to a show or a museum. We ran up the hill from my parents' apartment on Riverside Drive, lifting a hand to hail a cab. In we got. She leaned back in the cab, breathless. Removing the soft gray mohair beret from her head, her black hair now cut short with hints of white. Her green eyes shone bright with curiosity and anticipation of what was to come. Finally, she was living the life she had needed. Feminine and feminist, she refused to return to East Lansing. New York City matched her mood and soul, vital, bracing, crisp, and palpitating as a fall day. I love this place, she announced. Then age, Parkinson's. My mother started out an English major in college. She moved on to painting, then sculpture, earning her MFA at Michigan State University. She tells the story of her first casting. Her teacher, a man, pointed to her and the only other woman in the art class, stunning the men by allowing girls to do the pour. Empowered, they each took a side of the pole that held the crucible full of melted metal. They tipped it to pour the contents into the plaster mold. She fell in love with the molten lead She fell in love with the molten lead flowing like quicksilver. The fumes wafted about her, caressing, titillating. Her body's energy joining with aluminum, steel, and oxygen bonding, years later corrupting, and no reset button. Exposure to heavy metals can cause Parkinson's disease. My mother's passion in life, her work, arguably caused her disease. The consequence of that illness and its medications, mental fogginess, extreme exhaustion, and inability to work. Aware of her losses, she progressed from denial to anger to where was she now? My mother lived a dynamic, creative life. Given the choice, health or creation, would she give up having created? What makes life worth living? What is a worthy life? So I assume I'm not alone in having taken a hard look at life these days and what matters. We're all cooped up. What are our American values and what exactly have they become? How might I make a difference and where? I've concluded all of my readings with these little passages, and this one will be no exception. Years ago, one of my cousins had twins. Those two pips are men now. I have no idea how that happened. One of them studies black hole spins, astrophysics. The other studies cell structure, biochemistry. One cell split in two, and we have twins who study the biggest and the tiniest aspects of the universe in a yin-yang way because they explore the same thing, if in different forms, energy. Energy is complicated to describe, if only because everything in the universe is constructed of it. Fortunately, I go for the big picture, not the details. I remember when I moved to Darwin's View, I told the energy consultants that I wanted the light switch to work and don't care about the how of it. That's Carl's job and Mother's Nature's. So I think of energy as fuzzy balls of movement, electrons that don't exist in a physical sense because movement only exists relatively. See the theory of general relativity. So if you try to look at an electron by taking a picture of it, it isn't there because it is movement. And even by attempting to photograph it, you disturb and therefore change it. See Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Electrons hopping around the universe in various forms. They jump from one ring to another, bonding together to make minerals and rocks, or the atoms that make cells that make us. They careen back and forth between me and my chair, Carl and me, the chickens and cats. Energy connects me to everything around me, even to some people I'd rather not be connected to. But still, it's an incredible thought to be so much a part of something and ever changing, like a shimmering web of vibrations. Go to the very edge of you, and you will find you are a part of someone or something else. I get dazzled by that fact. Microbes and mycelium, plants and animals, the soil and stones, water and fire, the stars and planets, mothers and Mother Nature. All energy, all movement, and movement is relative. Depending on how one thing moves, so does another. So simple, yet overwhelming. Because if we are all connected in ways we cannot see but are minutely and directly affected by, then it matters how we move and what we do. Everything we do matters. This logic added a degree of pressure to my actions. It meant the world, maybe even the universe, depended on me. So, in these pages are tales in which I couldn't save a chicken, nor did I save my mother. And certainly many of my choices held contradictions, discrepancies between what I say and what I do. But I have learned that our soils can be regenerated and thereby grow plentiful and healthier food, while also drawing down carbon. Regenerative ag and support your local farms is the rage these days. And I know that if we shop differently, eat differently, and shift our attitudes from the comfort zone of complacency and convenience to an embrace of the changes necessary for a more just and humane society, not only can we, but we will save this nation and this world, maybe even our species. So, anyway, I'm just going to conclude by saying I think it depends on how each of us make our choices with the knowledge that our every action matters and that we are responsible for the consequences as well of those actions as well. So that's my reading, and I'd love to have any questions.
Thank you, Tori. Thank you very much. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. You should see a button below there. I think Lori probably has a question.
I always have questions, but I definitely want to encourage the audience because it's not the Lori show, but I always have questions. Tori, first, thank you. I'm sorry we could not figure out how to put the audience on, and I'm sorry you couldn't hear me laughing at the funny spots because, boy, there's a lot of humor there. And I love how you took the specifics of your own life and extrapolated it for us into the larger questions that we're all struggling with. I'm also struck by the fact that this pandemic, this almost a year now, makes your book sort of prescient in the fact that you're dealing with some of the sort of things that maybe more of us are questioning now. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that. Has the pandemic changed your lifestyle in any way, or were you guys pretty much ready for it, unbeknownst to you?
Not being safe to leave one's home and go out in public, I think, has been a pretty dramatic change for everybody. We do tend to be relatively self-sufficient, but we need one of the things that does strike me is that nobody, and I mentioned it in that reading at one point, we're all of us totally dependent. People who don't think we need roads and all these other things are much more independent than I am. It seems as if we were preppers coming up here. A lot of people thought, oh, did you want to get ready? And when the book came out, a lot of magazines and stuff were asking for articles that are prepper magazines. And we're not preppers. If anything, we're really unprepared we tend to be unorganized about things. But agree, it's, a lot of people started adopting chickens when the pandemic started, figuring out, well, we'll raise the chickens and we'll eat them. And I heard my impression was that it was in New York, and I was just trying to imagine how are they going to kill those chickens? Because at one point, anyway, it's, these are living creatures, good luck. We have these crazy kittens running around right now. And little animals have a lot of power in them. So I've lost my train of thoughts, but the book has a lot of different themes in it that are.
Tori, we have a question that
Huh?
links to your kitties, so we could address that. This is a question from Jenny Dixon. She wants to know, she says, John and I would like to know how the kitties and the chicks get along in light of how we all have to get along, even though we may not want to. So do they get along?
Yeah. Well, there's been, well, they're kept pretty far away when we have little chicks. We're sort of transitioning. Our cats, Nick and Nora, who we had for 17 years, Nora died in October of 2019, and Nick died in November, or was it September of this year? So it was kind of a tough thing. But we just adopted these kittens. Nick and Nora, when we would have chicks in the house, would be quite interested in them, but they never tried to do anything to them. And we have indoor cats, so they don't go outside. There was the infamous time that we brought the chickens into the greenhouse because it was going to be something like negative 18 degrees, and I just couldn't stand the idea of the chickens being outside. And that just ended up being the night that, or the next morning, I put too much wood in the fire after it had died down. And so anyway, the fire alarms went off and 5 different fire engines came up here, and the chickens were almost in the house. And it was quite embarrassing. But they seem to get along. They recognize they all have their own needs, and the interactions are pretty minimal. They respect each other's boundaries, I guess I would answer in that question.
Great. Would you tell us a little bit about, you mentioned I'm sorry, you're finishing your thought. Oh, I was just going to say, you were talking about the chickens, and you talked earlier about the idea of happy eggs. Are you guys gardeners too? Are you doing a lot of food growing on your property? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we're trying, and every year we get better and better. Every year until last year, probably, we seem to be digging everything up that we just created and recreating it. So for the last year, we've been working with a man named Dave Jackie, who wrote a book called Edible Forest. Sorry, Carl's right over here. He's Edible Forest Gardens. And we've been actually making a plan, which if you read the book, you will realize is not our forte. We tend to be more spontaneous about things, but we've been laying out a vision and talking about the ideas and making observations. And as Dave likes to put it, that you put this stuff on paper and you talk about it before you actually pour cement or do anything drastic. So this year, we're going to be enlarging the garden area on the southeast corners. We're going to have the orchard. We're going to put in a new orchard, and then we're going to have a more contained and organized garden. So we are doing a lot more gardening. We are learning a lot more. I am good at getting seeds, and once I get them in the soil, it's okay. And then they get to be about this big. Last year, I was so proud of myself. I put them out and planted them, and I went out to see how they did overnight, and the porcupine and raccoon had eaten them. So I had to start all over. So you live and learn, But yes, we are doing the gardening as well as the chickening.
Awesome. How long has it been that you've been living up there full time now? How many years?
We became full-time residents here in 2016. I know that because we wanted to vote up here for the election. So it's been there, and we sold anyway. Yeah. So
as we conclude, and again, we invite anybody else in the audience, but what's ahead of you in terms of living? Are there some new adventures you want to embark upon? It might be, altering your home or the land that you're on, or places you might want to go, or things to learn about. Tell us what might be coming up.
Yeah. With all that's been going on in the world, we've been asked to be on the board of Land for Good, which is an organization which works for keeping new, and I'm not going to say this right, but transitioning farmers and new farmers and keeping land as farmland. And that is one of the most vital things I think that's going on right now, because if we lose farmland, we won't have anywhere to grow our food. And so Carl and I are both really excited about that. And then that so caring for our land, regenerating our land, helping others somehow to keep their land, farmland, and then the social justice issues coming in. Some of the documentaries and conferences we've been zooming in on, it's horrifying. It really brings to mind what's gone on in the history of the United States. So I'm really hoping that a lot of our work going forward also somehow, some way, does do some form of reparations, because I think all of us have been traumatized in our own ways by decades of not really taking care of and respecting Mother Nature. And we really need to get back to that. And I think both Carl and I are really hoping to play a role in that as we go forward. So.
Well, Tori, we have
That's the
another
first
question for you. Harriet Crane asks, why not live off the grid in a warmer place?
That's an excellent question. Carl is from Peterborough, New Hampshire, which is right this town over from Jaffrey. So this is really home for Carl. And both Carl and I prefer to be cold than hot, because you can always put more clothes on, but when you're hot, there's not much you can do. And if we wait a decade or two, it's going to be pretty warm here too. So, but that's why we're here, is really Carl's homeland. It's Carl's home and mine.
Well, we have one last comment, not necessarily a question. It's from Rick Roberts. He says, hi, T, great to see you online and doing well atop the mountain. Do you have my room ready? Archie is 3 times the size of your cats, but I'll talk to him. Missed you and Carl this season. Thanks for Lulu's number. The spirit of anything is forever. So congrats on the book, he says.
All right, nothing like friends to come up on the talk. I appreciate that. And I know you have friends in Stonington who are in our audience today, and we're so glad to have that. Tori, thank you so much for sharing this part of your life. I'm eager to read the book. I encourage our audience to purchase it. The link is in your email. Go to Bank Square Books and support our local authors. I think it's just wonderful and a great tribute to your mother that both her daughters are artists, that you're a writer and Xanda's a visual artist, and you're extending her legacy and being very thoughtful about the kind of work that you do in helping the rest of us. So at Crossroads with Chickens, thank you for sharing your home and your kittens and your husband with us tonight. Thank you in the audience. Thank you for being with us, and everybody be safe and be well. Good night.